Number 1. Back in 2003, I was 12 years old and living in southern Illinois. I have a scar on my right elbow from falling off my bike in the woods, and it's because of that scar I can never go very long without remembering that one summer night when something followed us home from the woods. One day I was visiting my friend Aaron with the intention of staying the night, and we both were riding bikes with our friend Ryan. By road, they lived a good 10 minutes away from each other, but using a path through the woods, we could ride our bikes for less than a mile before we met each other at the halfway mark. So we were riding through the woods on our mountain bikes, popping wheelies and going over little dirt mound jumps, completely irresponsible and without helmets, just enjoying being daring and young and feeling invincible. We took a few tumbles, but I got it the worst when I flipped over my handlebars and slammed my elbow against a tree stump. I was bleeding pretty bad from a really ugly scrape, so Aaron and I decided to head back. It was starting to get late anyway. Ryan took off down the path one way, and Aaron and I went down the other, me trying not to look like I was in too much pain. About halfway home, Aaron stopped and asked me what that rustling sound was behind us. I stopped as well and listened. I heard a kind of shambling rustling sound from not too far away and shrugged it off as probably being just roaming squirrels bouncing through leaves. Aaron shook his head and started to look worried. He said whatever was making the sound was too big to be a squirrel, and he started riding faster back to his house up the path, me struggling to keep up. When we reached his yard, his dog was barking furiously back at the woods, but he was chained to the back porch and couldn't get any closer to the tree line than he already was. Even after we parked our bikes in the garage, he still kept barking in the direction of the path. Aaron's stepfather came out to take the dog inside, but he was barking so viciously that he decided to let him off the chain and let him chase away whatever was out there. Aaron's stepfather figured that it might be a bear or a coyote that was wandering too close. The dog bolted towards the woods, snarling viciously, and disappeared into the shadows. As Aaron's mom bandaged up my arm, his stepdad brought his spotlight from his boat out into the backyard and shone it into the trees. After about 10 minutes, the dog still hadn't come back. He told us to leave the back porch door open, so when the dog did come back, he could get in. Then he drove off to work the night shift. Aaron's mother worked early morning, so she went to bed around 8. Aaron and I stayed up playing PlayStation in his living room. After it was full dark out, we pretty much forgot about the dog and the woods, and we were completely engrossed in our game. There came a point where the game screen was loading as we moved on to the next level, and when it did, for the briefest moment, inside the room was complete darkness, and we saw something reflected in the TV screen against the back porch window. Something big and hairy. I spun around and cursed loudly, and Aaron let out a shriek of his own. We both jumped to our feet, and suddenly the thing in the window was gone. We heard something with a heavy bulk slamming against the porch door and go down the wooden steps. Aaron and I sprinted upstairs to his bedroom and looked out the window. To this day, we can both describe what exactly we saw running across the yard, back towards the woods. It was something with 6 elongated legs, very hairy, with its body extremely low to the ground. So low that it ran directly under Aaron's tire swing without grazing it. I'm not exactly sure what Aaron was thinking, but before I could stop him, he flung open his window. "We have a gun!" Which of course, we didn't. For the rest of the night, we stayed in his room, both of us too afraid to go downstairs and lock the porch door. The sliding door to the kitchen was still between us and the porch, and that was locked, so that gave us some comfort. After about 4 in the morning, I woke up from a light sleep. Aaron was passed out on the floor by his bed. I climbed over him and peered out the window. Now, people have told me that this part may have been a dream, but I don't think it was. This has stuck with me, vividly. Over by the tree line, I saw an old man with a white beard leaning on a crooked stick and looking up at the house. I watched him for what felt like 2 whole minutes, but he never moved. I left the room to use the bathroom, tiptoeing the whole way, and when I came back, the old man was gone. But the tire swing was gently swaying back and forth. The dog never came back, and Aaron's stepfather yelled at us for the scratches on the glass the next morning. That same summer, 4 more dogs in the area went missing. After that night, we only rode our bikes at my house. Every time I look at the scar on my elbow, I remember the old man, and I wonder if he saw me, and if he remembers my face.
Number 2.
This story isn't mine, but my dad's. Back in 1988, my dad and his brother lived in Saskatchewan, Canada, and used to hunt game for a living, mostly deer. My father and his brother were trying to obtain legal permission to hunt on a 40-acre property, but it was difficult because the owner didn't live there anymore. And on the entire section of land, there was only one small wooden house. My dad wanted to legally be covered because he didn't want to be taken to court for poaching, and he especially didn't want anyone to shoot him for trespassing. He eventually had to contact the owner personally by phone and make his request. The owner was an older man and stated firmly that no one was supposed to be on the property, as his son had died there a decade before. My dad found out later that the man's son had actually suffered a horrible death when his arm became caught in a wood chipper and he was slowly dragged in after it. The machine jammed and he was able to break free and clawed to the cabin in agonizing pain, where he eventually bled to death. My dad tried to negotiate a deal with the owner, but ultimately failed. Fortunately for my dad, the owner died about 6 weeks later, and the land was passed on to the town. My dad was able to work out a deal where he could hunt on the property. Early one morning, my dad and my uncle set out onto the property and began tracking a buck. It led them directly to a clearing where the old cabin was. My father shot the deer and wounded it, and it took off into the woods. Before making to follow it, he suggested to my uncle that they check out the house. They had no intention of going inside. They just wanted to peek in through the windows before going after the deer. But halfway across the overgrown lawn, they both heard a scream coming from inside. They both raised their guns and charged forward as the scream came again, a blood-chilling wail of pain. My dad broke down the door and walked into the kitchen, and the first thing he noticed was a trail of bloody handprints leading across the tiled floor. The prints were made with only a left hand. He told my uncle to stay put and followed the handprints back to the room, where a giant red stain covered most of the rug. There was a single bloody left handprint on the table, next to the phone. My dad suddenly heard the scream again, but this time it was directly in his ear, as if someone was standing behind him. My dad fired off a shot in shock and sprinted back out of the house and nearly collided with my uncle in the yard. They abandoned the deer they shot and never went back on the property again. The house was eventually torn down, and the land was sold in 1990.
Number 3.
Back in late February of 2015, a few of my friends and I decided to pack up some tents and go urban exploring. Deep in the woods, far beyond where my property line ended, there was an old abandoned military installation, complete with guard towers and a chain-link fence. The road had long since been overgrown and was no longer usable, so we drove as far as we could, before throwing on our backpacks and trudging down the path on foot. Once we were all well out of cell phone range, we finally saw the rusty fence and the main gate up ahead. We were all able to easily slip through the gate and began wandering through the old buildings. Most of them were decked out in graffiti of swastikas and penises, but a handful were still locked up tight. There was an office closed off inside one of the buildings, and through one grimy window, I could make out a folded newspaper with an ancient coffee stain on it. We explored the site for a couple of hours, and when the light started to fade, we made a campfire under one of the guard towers and cracked open some beers. My friend Melissa and I climbed up the ladder onto one of the tower's platforms and took a few pictures of the sunset. We enjoyed the view so much, we talked the others into putting out the fire and setting up the tents on the platform. All of the tents were assembled at the top of the 30-foot tower. We laid on our backs on the rusty metal floor and looked up at the stars. After about 40 minutes, Melissa called it a night and got into her tent. I was getting ready to follow suit, when I heard the chain link fence at the perimeter rattle. We all went very quiet and listened. A small animal wouldn't have made a noise that large. We recognized the sound because it was the exact same type of rattle we made when we entered. After a few minutes, we figured that it must have been the wind or a stray dog, and settled into our tents, still talking to each other. I was the one who heard it first, and yelled at the others to shut up. There was a stomping through the leaves coming towards the base of the tower. It wasn't careful or quiet. It was aggressive and loud. One of my friends stupidly shouted, "No soliciting," which raised absolutely no doubt as to where we were. We heard a heavy grunting and the sound of someone heavy climbing the ladder, and immediately we all started panicking. Melissa set up her tent directly on the trap door, so we fumbled to unzip her tent from the outside before the three of us literally jumped on top of her to put our full weight on the door. Melissa was screaming, and the three of us were yelling, asking the stranger who he was and to back off and just talk. Instead, he continued to slam his bulk into the trapdoor above him, and each time it made us jolt, but there was no way he would be strong enough to lift all of our weight. After another couple of minutes of loud shouting and poor Melissa getting all bruised up, we heard the sound of him descending the ladder. I glanced around in the dark. I didn't think any of the surrounding trees were close enough for the stranger to climb and jump onto the platform, but I immediately grabbed my flashlight and scanned the perimeter of the tower anyway, looking for potential weak spots. Whoever was down there wasn't identifying himself as police or any kind of law enforcement, so I assume he was trespassing just like we were, which made me incredibly nervous about what his intentions were. Suddenly we heard him climbing the adjacent guard tower that was about 50 yards away, much too far to jump, but we all immediately scrambled into Melissa's tent and hid ourselves as a small beam of light, potentially from a keychain flashlight, traced itself over the outline of our tent. We all remained silent and still, and after a few minutes, we heard the person descend the ladder of the far tower. That's when I heard the loud clatter of empty beer cans being kicked from below. There was more than one person down there. My suspicions were confirmed after another minute, when at least 2 sets of footsteps began circling the base of our tower. If they were speaking to each other, they were whispering so quietly that I couldn't hear a thing. We spent all night crammed into Melissa's tent, lying on the trapdoor to prevent anyone from getting in. In retrospect, that probably wasn't the best idea. Whoever these strangers were may have figured out a way to stick a knife or a sharp object up between the metal slits and potentially hurt one of us. Hell, if they had a gun, they would have known directly where to shoot. But fortunately nothing like that happened. I spent most of the night awake, on edge, listening. But once the sound of footsteps made for the surrounding buildings, I didn't detect them again. It was only when the light of dawn started to appear that I felt comfortable enough to get some real sleep. None of us left the tent until about 10 a.m., and the girls desperately had to use the bathroom. I peeked over the side in every direction and concluded that the coast was clear. I made for my tent, and as I was starting to disassemble it, I detected the smell of something rancid, like swamp water, coming from within. I poked my head into the tent, and the first thing I noticed was that my blanket was gone. There was a filthy scarf lying in a bundle that wasn't mine, and there was a newspaper with a large coffee stain crumbled up by the tent flap. Someone had made it up to the tower and spent the night in my tent. Someone who had access to the locked buildings around us. I abandoned the tent, and we all sprinted out of the compound and back to the car, which fortunately was untouched. To this day, I still don't know how the stranger or strangers got up there, or how I wasn't able to hear them, or most importantly, why they didn't grab us when they had the chance.
There's always a reason to be afraid.